Alright. Just making sure I got everything set up. So, this is going to kind of be an unorthodox stream, and I'm probably not even going to go that long. I have dead cells here, so I can just do maybe a couple of runs while I rant, but it's going to be a, it's essentially going to be kind of a rant about a few things that I've been just wanting to put out there. And I've said them to a couple of friends, but I kind of just want this, I guess, to be on record, sort of just on a thing I can go back and listen to and have maybe someone else listen to. So it's going to be kind of rambly, but oh well. So I'm going to go ahead and get into playing this. Yes. And if this gets content, uh, claimed, I don't care. I'm not trying to monetize these anyway. So I guess I'll just kind of go as I go. There we go. So essentially, it had to do with, I guess, some games that I've seen had a certain, I guess, flow to them, or a certain, just games that operated in a certain way, all of a sudden, in my opinion, arbitrarily changing their systems to fit like a different crowd. And maybe it was for the purpose of they felt like it needs a stylistic shift for pure artistic reasons. Maybe it was they saw a trend going on and they said, screw artistic integrity, we want to chase a trend, let's change our game to fit that trend. And basically I've seen this, in my opinion, happen with, definitely it's happened in the realm of fighting games, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to specifically talk about a game that I have really enjoyed for many years, ever since it came out, and that was God of War. This is mainly going to be a God of War thing. I may bring up other games as an example, but this all started when the new God of War came out. The one that came out, I think, in 2018 on PS4. So that game came out, and there were definitely some people that were, you know, against its new direction. But for the most part, that game had generally good reception. Right, 9s out of 10s, 10s out of 10s, amazing critic and user reviews all around. Amazing game. If you were to ask anyone, generally they would say, no, this game's amazing. For me, I saw the trailer, saw the gameplay, watched playthroughs, played it briefly when it came out on PS4 as one of the free games for the PlayStation Plus promotions. After watching a full 10-hour playthrough on YouTube, looking at all the cutscenes multiple times to understand if I had the context right or not of certain scenes, just to make sure I really understood what I was getting in a tizzy about. I was like, no, this really isn't God of War to me. I understand that, you know, a game can be interpreted different ways by different people, but whenever I looked at God of War, you know, if we're purely looking at the early games, 1 up to Ascension, the games had a certain feel, a certain flavor, and a certain just general flow of how those games operated, right? They were pretty simple brawler style games, you know, not, oh, shit, hold on, let me actually do this right. There we go. they focused on really fun but simple combat, but combat that did have options at the end of the day. Um, if you look back at the like making of DVDs of the series, where you had people like David Jaff, if I'm saying his name right, hopefully it's not Jaffe or something, but if it's David Jaff and some of the other people on his team, uh, they were very much inspired by things like Devil May Cry, and other games. I think even things like Rygar, and they wanted to make a game that was essentially like those types of games, but uh, it was their own thing. It was something that wasn't quite as in-depth in terms of its combat mechanics. Definitely nothing I would deem to be maybe a spectacle fighter, like what Platinum Games has going on with their games nowadays, like Bayonetta, and most recently, obviously, Devil May Cry 5, even what do you call those games? In any of Platinum's games, Metal Gear Rising, Revengeance, maybe not as in-depth or crazy as those, but definitely still fun. It was a game that focused on heavy and light attacks, and then you had various moves that you could combo with that created combos. You had a hit counter that tracked, combos and, repeated hits one after another. And when you, oh shit, I'm not really focusing right now, but when you see that sort of thing, you're like, okay, so this game is focusing on hits being done, connected hits and combos being done. It's something that sort of rewards that thing. The reward in God of War was just kind of a more or less a bragging rights, like, oh, look at my 30-hit, 40-hit combo, right? But I think it would also maybe net you a little bit more EXP than someone who maybe didn't do that stuff. So there was an incentive to maybe go for higher combos. Similar to, obviously Devil May Cry's style meter. Somebody who goes for those style points, or someone that understands the mechanics enough to do like more intricate combos that have you switching weapons in between combos and enemies and not getting hit, right? You get rewarded for those things versus someone who doesn't. One key thing in the new God of War is there's no real distinction between someone that goes for combos and someone who doesn't. You get the same EXP regardless. You don't get more EXP in the new God of War for stringing together a bunch of hits, doing perfect blocks or perfect dodges. You are rewarded for perfect blocks in the sense you get a parry and a bigger opening for an attack. That is the distinct reward for something like that. But in terms of EXP, because EXP is a thing in that game that's more traditional RPG. No, you don't. There's no incentive to switch between weapons in this game. Mainly the weapons you get in this game is the axe that you see Kratos have. He does get other weapons in the game. I'm obviously told, his fist count as a weapon. He has his newer axe. And then he later, obviously spoilers if you haven't seen anything about the game, he does eventually get his Blades of Chaos / Blades of Athena back. Although I would argue that they don't really operate the same way, seeing as the entire game operates completely different. It's not exciting to really get those weapons back. I can't do half the things I would do with those weapons. The only thing that I would say is an advantage is now I have a weapon that can attack in like wide arcing swings more than my axe now. They cover a wider area. So I guess for that, it's pretty cool. But they're considered more of a power up than something of an actual different weapon. So I was disappointed on that front. I was sort of excited to be like, oh, at least I get the Blades of Athena back. But nope, I'd rather have them not just been in there, considering, you know, how they operate. When it comes right down to it, I don't know, when I'm looking at God of War, I see a game that definitely isn't like the biggest type of spectacle fighter like some of the games it's inspired by, but it never had to be. You know, it did what it did, and it was fun. You know, fun, light and heavy mixed combos, mixing in item abilities and sometimes magic abilities, usually having some sort of super when a meter fills up after, you know, getting a number of hits. You know? And that's what it had in it. And it was a fun Greek epic tale, one of revenge, what revenge can do to you, how it can corrupt you. Pretty solidly told tale all around, mixed with fun, epic, over-the-top action, lots of spectacle. One of the things that it did to make up for the fact that it obviously wasn't as really technical, although there are a good amount of pretty technical or fun creative combos I've seen people do. There are combo videos for the different God of War games. While it's not like your Devil May Cry or your Bayonetta or whatnot, right? It had spectacle. More, bigger, over-the-top fights. You were fighting titans. You were fighting giant enemies. You were fighting on, like in God of War 3, you were fighting on Gaia's back while she climbed up Mount Olympus while you went to go fight the gods that you've been waiting to get to after so many games. Then while you're on Gaia's back while she climbs up Mount Olympus, you're being besieged or targeted by Poseidon, who's in this gigantic, you know, titanic form where he's a water being surrounded by the horses that look like they're snakes. It's cool. That was the cool part of God of War, is it tried to put in so much spectacle and just constant, like, non-stop pace of just things happening. And then there were times where things were slower paced, like in puzzle sections or rooms where you had to, you know, figure out, like, you know, a pretty simple puzzle, nothing crazy. But, you know, something that was able to break up the constant pace of action with a bit of a slower pace. Never once did I sit there in any of the God of War saying, man, I wish this game were just slower, more plotting, and had less options. I never sat there thinking that ever once. If anything, I wanted them to add more and more and more, and they seemed like they were going in that direction. One of the coolest things they added in Ascension, one of the games after 3, was the ability to tether onto 2 different enemies and, you know, do interactive actions when that happened. Like, you could attack with your offhand with your other blade. I thought they were going to build on things like that. But nope. And if there's anything that's in God of War from the other God of Wars, it just feels less satisfying. Like, in the other God of Wars, in God of War 2, they introduced the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece was a way to parry your opponent's attacks, and then if you did it, you know, on time, you'd get the ability to push them back, and they'd be open up for an attack, or they'd be a bit stunned. If it was a physical hit, if it were a ranged hit, you would reflect the projectile back at the opponent. Dealing, I don't know how much damage, but probably whatever the damage of the projectile was, plus whatever multiplier, like maybe 2 times what the projectile would have done, back at them. If it was a physical hit, you could do things like an AoE blast that would knock people up in the air, or you could do a knockback hit. You know, cool things like that. You could freely jump in the air in between combos, hit people up in the air. You could, oh crap. I'm not very good at talking and doing things, so I'm just kind of having this as something to do while I ramble. I want to get better at, you know, being able to talk and also do things, and this is just more or less practice, but yeah, it was just pretty satisfying to have a pretty fun, simple, yet still engaging combat system that allowed me to kind of just do what I wanted, when I wanted, for the sake of being fun, rather than this new game that seems to do things for the sake of telling a serious story, but it forgets kind of the fun, you know, goofy, dumb aspects of God of War that it used to have. Like, one review I heard said a pretty good thing where they said they probably took out double jumping because in game it looked silly to see a character double jump. It wasn't realistic enough to see a character double jump. So they made it so Kratos is pretty much grounded, and anytime he can jump, it's a context-sensitive action where you have to go up to something, press it, and he does a canned animation of jumping that you don't have control over. Pretty much at a point where he has to clear a gap or jump up some vertical climb, but you have no control over it. It's basically just done for you. And I'm like, well, that's stupid. You're telling me that you wanted it to look more serious and more quote-unquote mature, so you took out what was a fun, useful mechanic like double jumping because you wanted your game to look more serious. So they wanted the gameplay to complement the narrative instead of the narrative maybe just complementing the gameplay. You know? Like, gameplay is key in the game. Let me double jump. Let me have combos where I can hold a heavy attack, and holding the heavy attack launches an enemy, and then if I hold the button, I can follow up with air-based attacks, where I have wide arcing spinning buzzsaw like moves, grapple attacks that I can do on the air. One of the coolest things I saw in an evolution of God of War was in God of War 1 to 2. You could do attacks where you hit an enemy up in the air, and you had the choice of following up with them to do an air combo, or staying on the ground and doing like further like different types of juggles, or doing a grapple attack that pulled them back down to you, and then vice versa in the air, moves that brought them up to you with a grapple attack. One of the coolest things they did in 3, and they showed it directly in the trailer, was a new move called Combat Grapple, where you could grapple up to enemies that were up in the air with your blades. You didn't have to do a canned or a follow-up animation by holding heavy. You know, you could actually grapple up to them, and it didn't matter if they were light enemies or heavy enemies. And they were building upon the mechanics game by game. Then you had Ascension, which really had its grapple mechanics down to a T, where you could do everything that you could do in previous games, except now do this like 2-part grapple mechanic where you could tether between 2 enemies. Basically grapple one enemy with one of your chained blades and then still attack with your offhand. You could use your chained tethered enemy as like a battering ram or a mace or some sort of projectile to throw at them. And I thought, oh man, if they thought of this in this game, just think of what they'll do in the next. And I never got to see that built upon. Instead, I got to see a game that just felt like less. And And I'm mainly talking about gameplay things, not even narrative things, because that was one of the biggest things of God of War to me, was just all the things they did in the game to make it a fun, brawler action game. A game that focused on action. And there is action in the new game, it just feels so piecemeal compared to what I was dealing with before. But they did it for the sake of being quote-unquote more mature. And if you're telling me that if your game is trying to be more mature, and this is the result I get, I'll take the game that's more adolescent or infantile any day then. If this is the result, I'm good. Because now the combat feels like I'm playing Gears of War, but if instead of guns, I just get melee weapons. And Kratos technically has a ranged weapon. He can throw his axe. But is that axe throw any better than, like, Apollo's bow that I got in 3? Probably not. Or Typhon's bow, where I can, like, knock enemies up in the air with a charged wind blast. Or Apollo's bow, where I can set enemies on fire if I fully charge it. Or if I hit enemies up in the air, I can juggle them with repeated, almost machine gun-like arrow shots. And if you're hearing all this, you're like, it sounds like you had a lot of options in the other games. And you're like, yes. You had options. You had variety. You had, combat depth. Not in here. They were more focused on telling a narrative, so the action had to take a backseat. That's its biggest crime to me. And yet, you know what's funny when you look at some of the cutscenes of the new God of War. There are certain scenes of Kratos jumping hundreds of feet in the air, right? And you're like, well, man, I wish I could do that. I wish I could feel like a powerful god. Powerful demigod character who's been in hundreds, if not maybe, hundreds of battles over his lifetime. I would love to feel like that individual instead of feeling like somebody who's like Kratos but neutered. And then whenever I tell people any of this, I'm usually countered with, well, I mean, whatever about any of that stuff. It's a game about a father and son. That's what I'm countered with. Is just it's a game about a father and son. It's wholesome. You're just being picky asshole, Isaiah. You need to be able to be open to new things. And I am. I'm open to new experiences and new interpretations. I really am. But when you lose the entire point of the series and what it was kind of going toward in terms of its gameplay mechanics, you lose me. If you want to maybe take a different spin on those mechanics, like, cool. But if you're just going to actually throw some away in favor of what is, to me, an objectively more boring experience, I'm good. And then some people want to tell me, well, what do you say to the people who liked all the other God of Wars, but they also like this one? And then I think, well, I would love to ask them, what were you getting out of the older games, like 1 through Ascension? What were you getting out of those that you're also getting out of this new one? Like, what were you getting? Like, what was this doing for you that you can play something like God of War 3 or Ascension or 2 or 1 or Ghosts of Sparta or Chains of Olympus that you're also getting out of this game? Were the combat mechanics not, like, even a thing you cared about and you could take them or leave them? I mean, at that point, that's like saying, oh, I played Devil May Cry, I played Devil May Cry 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, And then let's say they came out with a brand new God of War game that takes it in the same more narrative focused, slower paced, uh, almost walking simulator-esque game with action on the side approach that they did with the new God of War. And then they do that with Devil May Cry, right? No real focus on weapon switching, no style meter to reward you for combo or combo variants. None of that. But it's now behind the back, close camera, you know, almost Last of Us looking UI type shit. And you're like, you know, you find somebody who played all the others, really liked the combat engine, had a lot of fun. Then they play this new one, and then I ask them, what are you getting out of this new version? It's so starkly different in terms of its combat mechanics. I really have to pick your brain about what you're, what's like, what's this doing for you? And no one's really given me a good answer. They usually deflect to, I mean, well, you know, it being different isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm like, no, something being different isn't always a bad thing. No. I mean, hell, look at Devil May Cry 1, a very solid action game with a pretty clear-cut, like, goal in terms of what its combat wants to be and how you can build off of it. 1 took that idea and was different, but it didn't really capture the same magic as 1 did. It just felt off. And then, you know, 3 was very different from 2, but it went more in line with what 1 did, but it just enhanced everything. Combat was faster, more weapons, more weapon choice. They added things like weapon styles, so that you could focus on different combat maneuvers. You weren't just focused on sword. Maybe you wanted to focus on ranged combat and gun tricks. Then you had things like Trickster if you wanted to focus on mobility. They opened the avenue of combat options. They did not restrict them. They built upon what 1 was doing. 2 felt like a step in the wrong direction because it felt like 1 but just less in a way. Like, everything just felt off. Balance was really off. Guns could take care of most enemies. You could take on most bosses with just the guns alone. The combat didn't feel as fluid. It felt more stiff and jank. It also didn't help that you created a game in which you had a clearly charismatic protagonist, and now he's dead silent. It seemed to miss the mark of what 1 was trying to do. That was its main sin. But also just that the combat didn't feel as good. Going back to God of War, the new God of War, that's what it felt like to me. I can't double jump or jump in the slightest. I'm tailored to just being on the ground. My viewing angle is now completely centered around what's in front of me. And then for me to be able to look at anything around me, I have to turn around. Games that God of War was inspired on either had, you know, a fixed camera or it had a camera that you could control. God of War went with the fixed camera route because the camera was panned up almost to an isometric view so you could survey your entire battlefield. And then it had dodging being directionally controlled by right stick. It was a pretty unique combat control mapping. It always worked well, like, you know, someone thought about how it would work, like they planned it out. I hear a lot of people come up and say that they didn't like the fixed camera. They like being able to control their camera. And I can see those complaints and actually see where people are coming from. But I think God of War did it in a way that made sense with how its combat operated, at least. It didn't feel like it was a tacked on thing or an afterthought. It felt like the combat was designed around the fact that the camera's in the position it's in. So engagements were always centered around big arenas that you could see the entire battlefield. And then you could act accordingly. Now it's combat is now down to me viewing things from just directly in front of me. Kratos takes up an immense amount of the screen space. And if I want to turn around to see my attackers, I have to fully turn around. There's no quick turn attack. They tried to supplement this by a lot of the moves you later unlock being AoE attacks, so even if someone is behind you, you can just do a big area of effect attack. But that also means a lot of the attack variance isn't that, well, varied. It's not that good. A lot of it feels like it's just making up for the fact that you can't see a lot of your attack range. And there is another way in which you are told if you're being attacked from behind, and that's a little compass-based threat indicator, similar to what you'd see in the shooting game. Like, if a grenade's rolling by you, you have a little indicator showing where the grenade is with a arrow. That's in the new God of War. But the weird thing about action games is one of the clear-cut ways that the game communicates to you you're being attacked is through visual identification. It's probably the most direct and best way an action game can communicate to you that an enemy is attacking you, in the fact that you can see the enemy attacking you, and you can base your reaction, right, based on enemy tells, learning what the enemy's moves are and reacting accordingly over time. Just, you know, through experience. Oh, I know what this enemy does because I fought them a bunch. You know, pretty simple stuff. And they have that in God of War, but the other way in which you have to communicate you being your character being attacked is through this more or less different audio visual way of being attacked. You could either hear them or you could see this little arrow, and it's more an auditory thing or a visual thing than auditory, because it's just a little arrow. There's no sound cue. So now you have two ways in which enemy tells are communicated to you, which is just the old, you're looking at the enemy, you can visually see what they're doing, and then the threat indicator of when, you know, when someone's around you or behind you. Oh shit. And the silly thing about this is sometimes it can give you a false alarm where the arrow is turning red, showing that they're about to, you know, attack you, but maybe it picked up like an attack that was about to hit you, but it just missed, it whiffed. So you're thinking you're about to be attacked when it actually was a whiffed attack, and then you turn around for no reason. And you have to commit to turning around. There's no quick turn attack. Kind of like in Resident Evil, where if you were to press like back and run, like a Resident Evil 3, you'd perform a quick turn to quickly deal with enemies. And that game, a quick turn made sense too, because not only did you have a fixed camera control scheme, but you also had an isometric fixed camera view most of the time, and you had tank controls, so a quick turn made sense. And these I could definitely see as being something that, like, you know, the fixed camera or even something like tank controls being something that maybe someone wouldn't like or be into, but that doesn't necessarily mean the mechanic's bad. It has a learning curve to it, and if you get to, you know, get used to it, it's fine. It works. It was a system that the entire game and its engagements of enemies were built around. That was the tension part of Resident Evil, was the tank controls, and the fact that when you were fighting some enemies, the enemies weren't super fast. They were slow, but they were also dangerous. But you had time to deal with the threat by getting ready and positioning yourself for an attack, backing up, aiming your gun at the right, in the right way, high or low, to hit them in the legs to potentially, you know, make them fall, or hitting them in that head, trying to get that sweet, sweet headshot and critical attack. It was all about positioning, being aware of your environment, and that added to the tension of the survival horror element of the game. And same thing with, I guess, God of War, where it wasn't for tension's sake, but it was for the sake of, that game had the camera panned out so you could view your entire combat space. And then you could act accordingly with the right dodges, parries. But now it's like, I'm completely now tied to viewing what's directly in front of me. And the people who complained about the fixed camera and the panned out camera in the old games say this is better somehow. And I'm like, I wouldn't necessarily call it better. It's different. And maybe this is something that you think is better, but the previous systems were completely fine. But I can say this. If you wanted to make the camera system different, why didn't you just experiment with a free camera control scheme, like Devil May Cry, or Ninja Gaiden, any of the Platinum games in general? Why didn't you just go with that? Why did you have to go with like a Last of Us style, Gears of War style, almost second-person view camera for an action game? Fine, you want to make it different? Copy the other good action games and what they do. Which, you know, God of War was a good action game. I'm not insinuating it was bad. But just do what some of the others do then at that point. That could be your experimentation. Oh, God of War's doing the free camera thing. And then with that free camera, expand the combat mechanics. But no, they went with a second-person view camera. And lessened the amount of combat mechanics and variants that you have access to. And I'm in a way almost talking myself in circles, but I see this game getting praised, usually not even for its combat mechanics. I don't see the action game getting praised for its action, right? A game that comes from an action game-based legacy. I see it getting praised for its graphics, which, fine, the game looks good. Santa Monica Studios has always done good graphical fidelity in terms of its games. It's always pushed its games in a good graphical sense each generation. So I expected that, right? And then for its story, which that's debatable, right? In terms of how its narrative played out. Right? That's debatable to me. I personally didn't like how it portrayed some of the Norse mythology and how Kratos interacted with that Norse mythology. I didn't like its interpretations of some of the gods and some other mythical figures. Particularly, and that more or less just had to do with the interpretation that the writers decided to go with and just some of the writing. As quote unquote juvenile as some of the other God of Wars tended to go and be, I thought its portrayal of the gods was pretty spot on in most cases. Some of them were callous, cruel, greedy, pompous. Some were worthy of reverence and respect. But most were really just, oh, hold on, I have never fought this before. Okay, there we go. Most were just haughty, really up their own ass, willing to backstab anyone to achieve their means. Anything that they did that was good for humanity never really, I guess in a way, made up for how much of dicks the gods could be at times, and how much they would ask of like mortal beings. Not to say that the gods never did anything worthy of, respect, but a lot of them just had ulterior motives, or just always had their own interests at heart. I mean, look at the narrative that was set up by previous God of War, right? You had a guy who was a Spartan general, bent on conquest and expansion of, Sparta. And one day he fought a force that he could not fight. They were besting him in combat. It was the barbarian forces. And he asked for help from his patron god Ares, and Ares did give him aid, but in return he had to basically give his life to Ares. And Ares sought to make him the perfect warrior. He saw an immense amount of potential in Kratos, and he bound these chains on him, basically representing his bond to Ares, and it gave him power. These mystical chained blades that basically gave him more and more experience the more he fought and killed and battled, which directly tied into a gameplay mechanic, by the way. Oh shit, the narrative didn't hinder the gameplay mechanics. It kind of made the gameplay mechanics cool, right? These blades that basically make Kratos stronger the more he fights directly tie into the fact that when you fight and kill enemies, you get red orbs, which represent the experience from battle. Weird. And from then on, he went on a bloody campaign of slaughter in Ares' name. And he goes on serving the gods and Ares for well over, I think, 10 years. But during that campaign and his time, Ares felt as though that to be a truly dedicated warrior, you have to have no ties to anything other than, well, Ares himself. And he felt as though Kratos would become basically a combat and battle personified if he had no earthly ties, which meant his family, sadly. So during one of his raids on a village that Kratos was taking in Ares' name, and basically for Sparta, Ares more or less teleported Kratos' family to that village, and in Kratos' bloodlust and slaughter, through this like dense fog during all the fire that they had set to the village, he had noticed that the people he had just slain were his wife and child, and he was confused, mortified at the fact that, wait a minute, these, like, my family was left in Sparta. He was like awestruck that they were even there, probably even briefly thinking that this was somehow a bad dream, or maybe this wasn't real, but it was real. He had slaughtered his family, and he was devastated. The oracle of the village had witnessed what he had done, and to basically make it so that he would never forget what had happened there that day, he had taken the ashes of his wife and child, or she had taken the ashes of Kratos' wife and child, and imprinted them on his body, which is why his skin is white. And this was an ever-present reminder of his greatest sin and failure. And he basically had started to serve the gods faithfully for many, many years after that event, in hopes that they would free him of his memories of that day. Because pretty much every time he goes to sleep, he sees their faces and, you know, him slaughtering them constantly, like just constant nightmares of his greatest failure, something that he wishes he could turn back but can't. And then one day he finally tells the gods, you know, enough's enough. I've served you faithfully for many, many years. I think 10 years at that point. And he would want them to basically free him of this nightmare, of this memory that he can't get rid of. And they said, hey, okay, we can do this for you, but if you only do one thing for us, and that is to kill the very god whom you pledged allegiance to, Ares. He's been gone kind of rogue lately, and we need you to take him out. And then Kratos is sitting there like, to kill a god? You ask such a task of me? They're like, oh, it can be done. If you go on this quest and go to these locations, you can do it. And then basically, that's what God of War 1 is. It's you going on this big quest to gain power, to basically kill a god. And the most fucked up thing about this is Kratos dutifully does this. At this point, he still has respect for the gods, but he's starting to grow wary of them constantly asking things of him. And he ends up actually killing Ares. We're going to skip ahead to the end. He actually ends up killing Ares. And, you know, at the end of all this, he simply asks the gods the one thing he's been asking for all this time. And they basically tell him, no, sorry, lol. No freeing from the memories of your pain past at all. You don't get it. Screw you, buddy. And you know what? Kratos doesn't get angry. You know, he doesn't get he doesn't go into a fit of rage. He becomes obviously insanely depressed. And feels as though like everything that he once believed in was a lie. The world's abandoned him. The gods have abandoned him. And you know, he goes to a cliff to kill himself. He's like, you know, the gods have abandoned me when I needed them most. I dutifully served them. I even felled a god for them. And they still would not give me the one thing I wanted. Just to have basically some level of internal peace. And when he didn't get it, he wanted to get it in death. And then the most fucked up part of this story to me is when he's about to hit the rocks, right? The gods stop him from falling and tell him that they require more of him. And that because he felled Ares, there needs to be someone else who sits on the throne of the God of War, and seeing as though that he managed to kill him, he could take his place. Imagine being at your lowest point in life, right? I know it's probably for some people hard to imagine being in the point where you're willing to kill yourself. But for a second, try to put yourself in someone's shoes where they want to kill themselves. Even something as over the top as wanting to throw yourself off a cliff, right? You're done. No more life. You're done. You have no reason to live in your mind. And the very people who denied you any sort of peace or respite in your mind to where you can't have a night's sleep without thinking of this, tell you, no, hey man, we need more of you. You'd be rightfully pissed. Right? You're done. And skip ahead, I'm not going over the PSP games because those are in-between stories. Still very good games, but we skip ahead to 2 where he's done. No more respect for the gods. He sees them as nothing to be praised or revered or to be prayed to or anything. he speaks to them, in no reverent way. He doesn't speak to them as Lord, or Lady Athena, nothing like that. He calls them just by their name, like he would any other mortal. No respect given. Uh, and he has become the new God of War, but begrudgingly. And he basically is now completely focused on the, what is it? God, I can't think of the word. The safety and prosperity of his people in Sparta now. That's what he's focused on. He is now the patron god of his people in Sparta. He's going to focus on them. And I'm going to have to cut this short, but I will go more into this later. I'll probably just go into this in my next stream, or I'll probably just try to condense what I've said into better bulleted talking points. But for anyone who's listened to me or listened to this, thank you. I'm going to have a better video when I have a bit more time. I just have a family thing coming up, so I'll need to go to that. But yeah, bye for now.